fall asleep to the story of Alexander the Great. In the ancient kingdom of Macedon, in the year 356 BCE, on a warm summer night, a child was born who would change the world forever. His name was Alexander, and he entered this world in the royal capital of Pella, a city of stone palaces and whispering olive groves. The night of his birth was said to be touched by destiny, for on that very same evening, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. Ancient writers would later say the goddess was too busy attending Alexander's birth to save her own temple. His father was King Philip II of Macedon, a brilliant military strategist who had transformed a fractured kingdom into a rising power. His mother was Olympias, a princess from the mountainous land of Epirus, known for her fierce intelligence and her devotion to mystical religious practices. Olympias would tell young Alexander that he was descended from heroes of legend. On his mother's side, she claimed lineage from Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, and through his father, from the mighty Heracles himself. These were not just bedtime stories. Alexander grew up believing divine blood flowed through his veins, and this belief would shape every decision he would ever make. As a boy in the Macedonian court, Alexander was given every advantage a prince could hope for. But the greatest gift his father ever gave him came when Alexander was 13 years old. King Philip sought out the most brilliant mind in all of Greece to tutor his son. That man was Aristotle, the philosopher who had studied under Plato himself. For 3 years, in a peaceful sanctuary called the Temple of the Nymphs at Mysa, Alexander sat at the feet of this master. Aristotle taught him philosophy, poetry, drama, science, and medicine. He introduced the young prince to Homer's Iliad, the epic tale of Achilles and the Trojan War, and Alexander became so enchanted with this story that he would carry a copy of it with him for the rest of his life, sleeping with it under his pillow alongside a dagger. The relationship between father and son was complex, filled with both admiration and tension. When Alexander was just 12 years old, something remarkable happened that revealed the boy's extraordinary character. A wild horse was brought to King Philip's court, a magnificent black stallion with a white star on its forehead, named Bucephalus, which means ox head. The horse was beautiful but completely untamable. Every trainer who approached him was thrown violently to the ground or nearly trampled. King Philip ordered the animal taken away, declaring him worthless. But young Alexander had been watching carefully. He had noticed something the others had not. The horse was afraid of his own shadow. Alexander approached his father and made a bold wager. If he could tame the horse, Philip would buy it for him. If he failed, Alexander would pay the price himself, 13 talents, an enormous sum. Philip agreed, perhaps amused by his son's confidence. Alexander walked calmly to the horse, gently turned him to face the sun so his shadow fell behind him, and spoke soothingly while stroking his neck. Then, in one fluid motion, the boy leaped onto the horse's back. Bucephalus, calm now, carried Alexander in a perfect gallop across the field. When Alexander returned, King Philip was said to have wept with pride, telling his son, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." Bucephalus would become Alexander's beloved companion, carrying him across thousands of miles of conquest for the next 20 years. By the time Alexander was 16, his education with Aristotle was complete, and his father put him to work. King Philip left his teenage son as regent of Macedon while he went to war, trusting Alexander to rule in his absence. The young prince did more than simply maintain order. When a Thracian tribe called the Mede rebelled, Alexander personally led the army against them, defeated them decisively, drove them from their territory, and established a new city populated by Greeks and Macedonians. He named it Alexandropolis, the first of many cities that would bear his name. 2 years later, at 18, Alexander commanded a crucial part of his father's army at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, where Philip finally achieved his greatest ambition, defeating the combined forces of Athens and Thebes to become the master of Greece. Alexander led the decisive cavalry charge that shattered the legendary sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit of 300 warriors who had never been defeated. They fought to the last man rather than surrender, and when the battle was over, Alexander stood among the fallen, having proven himself not just as a prince, but as a warrior and commander. Yet even as Philip stood at the height of his power, darkness gathered in his own household. The relationship between Philip and Olympias had deteriorated. Philip took another wife, a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, and at the wedding feast, Cleopatra's uncle stood and made a toast, calling for a legitimate heir to the throne, implying that Alexander, with his foreign mother, was not truly fit to rule. Alexander, enraged, hurled his cup at the man and shouted, "What am I then, a bastard?" Philip, drunk, drew his sword and lunged at his own son, but stumbled and fell. Alexander looked down at his father and said coldly, "Here is the man who would cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another." Alexander and Olympias left the court that night, withdrawing into bitter exile. Though father and son would eventually reconcile, the damage was done. The court was divided. Factions formed. And then, in 336 BCE, at a great celebration in the ancient Macedonian capital of Aegae, everything changed in an instant. During a grand procession, as Philip entered the theater alone and unguarded to show his confidence and power, a young bodyguard named Pausanias approached and drove a dagger into the king's ribs. Philip II, the man who had conquered Greece, died on the ground as assassins often do their work, suddenly and without ceremony. The question of who ordered the assassination has never been answered with certainty. Pausanias had personal grievances against Philip, but many suspected deeper conspiracies. Some whispered that Olympias had orchestrated it to secure her son's throne. Others pointed to rival Macedonian nobles or even Persian agents. The truth vanished into history. What remained was this: at just 20 years old, Alexander was now king. And the world, unknowing, was about to be transformed by what he would do next. In the days after his father's death, as the summer sun set over the mountains of Macedon, the young king stood at the threshold of destiny, grief and ambition intertwined in his heart. The throne was his. But it was not yet secure. And beyond the borders of his kingdom, an empire waited, vast and unconquered, stretching eastward beyond the edge of the known world. The young king's first challenge was not a foreign enemy, but the very people he was meant to rule. When news of Philip's death spread across Greece, many saw opportunity in the chaos. The great city-states that Philip had conquered believed a 20-year-old boy could never hold what his father had won. They were about to learn otherwise. Thebes, the proud city that had fallen at Chaeronea, was the first to rebel. The Thebans declared their independence and called on other Greek cities to join them in throwing off the Macedonian yoke. In Athens, the great orator Demosthenes, who had opposed Philip for years, celebrated openly, calling Alexander a foolish boy who would never leave Macedon. But Alexander moved with a speed that shocked the Greek world. In just 13 days, he marched his army from Macedon to Thebes, covering over 300 miles of difficult terrain. When the Theban rebels awoke one morning, they found Alexander's army already at their gates. The sight of the Macedonian forces was enough to make most of the city surrender immediately, but a faction of Theban fighters refused to yield. They barricaded themselves and prepared to fight to the death. What happened next would become one of the most controversial acts of Alexander's life. He ordered the city destroyed. His soldiers swept through Thebes, pulling down buildings, burning homes, killing thousands. When the destruction was complete, only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, whom Alexander admired, were left standing. 30,000 Thebans were sold into slavery. It was a message written in blood and ash: rebellion would not be tolerated. the destruction of Thebes sent shockwaves through Greece. Athens, which had been preparing to resist, immediately sent ambassadors begging for mercy. Alexander forgave them, not out of weakness, but out of respect for their cultural achievements. Sparta alone refused to acknowledge Alexander's authority, but they were isolated in the south, no longer the power they once were. The young king called a meeting of the Corinthian League, the alliance his father had formed, and the Greek cities formally recognized Alexander as their hegemon, their leader, just as they had recognized Philip. At 20 years old, Alexander had secured his throne and his father's conquests in a matter of months. But Alexander's ambitions reached far beyond Greece. His father had been planning something magnificent before his death, an invasion of Persia, the vast empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to India, the superpower of the ancient world. For generations, the Greeks had remembered how the Persians had invaded their lands, how they had burned Athens, how Greek cities in Asia Minor lived under Persian rule. Philip had planned to right these wrongs, and Alexander would fulfill his father's dream, but he would do so on a scale even Philip had never imagined. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander stood at the edge of the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia. His army numbered approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, along with engineers, surveyors, scientists, and even historians to record what would happen. It was not the largest army in the world, but it was superbly trained, battle-hardened, and led by a king who believed he was destined for greatness. Before crossing, Alexander did something that revealed his sense of drama and destiny. He sailed ahead of his army in a single ship, and when he approached the Asian shore, he threw his spear into the sand and leaped onto the beach in full armor, declaring that he accepted Asia as a gift from the gods, won by the spear. His first stop was the ruins of Troy, the legendary city where his ancestor Achilles had fought and died centuries before. Alexander walked among the ancient stones, ran naked around the tomb of Achilles in the custom of ancient athletes, and left his armor there as an offering, taking in exchange a shield said to have belonged to a warrior from the Trojan War. He would carry this shield into battle, connecting himself to the heroes of myth. Some saw this as the romantic gesture of a young man inspired by poetry. Others recognized it as something more calculated. Alexander was declaring that he was not just a king, but a hero from the age of legends, returned to reshape the world. The first test came quickly. The Persian satraps, the governors of the western provinces, had assembled an army to stop the invasion before it could truly begin. They met Alexander at the Granicus River in northwestern Asia Minor. It was late afternoon, and Alexander's generals advised him to wait until morning to cross the river and attack. Rivers are natural defenses, and attacking uphill through water against an entrenched enemy was tactically dangerous. But Alexander refused to wait. He declared that it would be shameful for the man who had crossed the Hellespont to be stopped by a mere stream. Alexander personally led the cavalry charge into the river. The water churned with blood as Macedonian horsemen clashed with Persian cavalry on the muddy banks. In the chaos of battle, Alexander became a target. Persian commanders recognized him by his distinctive armor and the white plumes on his helmet, and they converged on him. One Persian noble, Spithridates, raised his sword and brought it down on Alexander's head with such force that it split the king's helmet and cut into his scalp. Before Spithridates could strike again, Clitus, one of Alexander's oldest companions, thrust his spear through the Persian's body, saving the king's life. Alexander fought on, wounded but unbowed, until the Persian line broke and fled. The victory at Granicus opened the door to Asia Minor. City after city opened its gates to Alexander as he marched south along the coast. Some welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule. Others simply recognized reality: resistance was futile. Alexander was careful to show clemency to those who surrendered and to present himself not as a conqueror, but as a bringer of freedom. When he reached the Greek cities of Ionia on the western coast of Asia Minor, cities that had lived under Persian control for generations. He restored their democracies and freed them from tribute. The propaganda value was immense. Alexander was not just conquering, he was fulfilling the dream of Panhellenism, of uniting and liberating all Greeks. As he moved through Asia Minor in that first year of campaigning, Alexander encountered something that would become famous in legend. In the city of Gordium, the ancient capital of Phrygia, there was a chariot tied with an intricate knot of cornel bark. The knot was so complex that no one could find where it began or ended. Local prophecy declared that whoever could untie the Gordian knot would become the ruler of all Asia. Many had tried. All had failed. When Alexander arrived and was shown the knot, he studied it carefully. Ancient sources differ on exactly what happened next, but the most famous account says that Alexander drew his sword and, with a single stroke, cut the knot in half. "It makes no difference how it's untied," he reportedly said. Whether he actually cut it or found a clever way to untie it, the message was clear: Alexander would not be bound by the same rules as other men. He would rule Asia, one way or another. By the end of his first year in Asia, Alexander had secured the entire western coast of Asia Minor, defeated a Persian army, liberated dozens of cities, and marched hundreds of miles through often hostile territory. He had been wounded in battle but had never retreated. His soldiers were beginning to see him not just as a king, but as something more, blessed by the gods, perhaps even divine himself. And ahead, across the mountains and plains of Asia, the great king of Persia, Darius III, was gathering the largest army the world had ever seen. The young king from Macedon had won his first battles. But the true test of his destiny was still to come, in a confrontation that would decide the fate of empires. As autumn came to the lands of Asia Minor, Alexander's men made camp beneath unfamiliar stars, thousands of miles from home. They had followed their young king across the threshold of the known world, and there would be no turning back. The path ahead led deeper into the heart of the Persian Empire, toward wealth and glory beyond imagination, or toward destruction. In the heart of the Persian Empire, Darius III, the great king, king of kings, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known, was preparing his response. Darius was not a weak man, nor a foolish one. He had come to power through palace intrigue and had survived by being cautious and calculating. But he had inherited an empire that was vast beyond measure, stretching from Egypt to the borders of India, and such vastness brought its own weaknesses. The news from the west troubled him deeply. This young Macedonian had done more than simply raid the coastline. He had defeated a Persian army, liberated cities, and showed no signs of stopping. In the autumn of 333 BCE, Darius personally took command of an enormous army and marched west to confront Alexander. Ancient sources claim the Persian force numbered in the hundreds of thousands, though modern scholars believe this was exaggerated. Still, it was certainly much larger than Alexander's force. The two armies met at Issus, a narrow coastal plain pinched between the mountains and the sea in what is now southern Turkey. The terrain favored Alexander, as Darius could not use his numerical advantage in such a confined space. The battle began with a clash that shook the earth. Alexander, as always, led from the front, commanding his elite companion cavalry on the right wing. He identified where Darius himself stood in the Persian center, surrounded by his royal guard and immortals, and Alexander did what seemed like madness: he charged directly at the great king. The Macedonian wedge formation cut through the Persian lines like a knife, driving toward the royal standard. On the other side of the battlefield, the Persian left wing was actually pushing back Alexander's forces, and for a moment, the battle hung in balance. But then Alexander's cavalry reached Darius. The great king, seeing the Macedonian warriors cutting down his guards, seeing Alexander himself pressing closer, made a decision that would haunt him. He turned his chariot and fled. The sight of their king retreating broke the Persian army's spirit. What had been an organized battle became a rout, with thousands of Persian soldiers streaming away in panic. Alexander pursued them relentlessly until darkness fell. In Darius's abandoned camp, Alexander found treasure beyond imagination: gold, silver, luxurious tents, and something more precious, Darius's own family. The great king's mother, wife, and daughters had been traveling with the army and were now Alexander's prisoners. What Alexander did next surprised everyone. Rather than treating them as spoils of war, he visited the royal women and assured them they would be treated with the respect due to royalty. When Darius's mother, Sisygambes, mistakenly prostrated herself before Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend and companion who was taller and more richly dressed, Alexander gently told her she had made no mistake, for Hephaestion was also Alexander. The kindness shown to Darius's family became famous throughout the Persian Empire, and it was a masterstroke of propaganda. Here was a conqueror who respected Persian customs and honored even his enemies' loved ones. After Issus, the path to the heart of Persia lay open, but Alexander did not take it immediately. Instead, he turned south, moving down the Mediterranean coast. His reasoning was strategic. The Persian fleet still controlled the seas, and as long as they did, they could threaten Greece and cut Alexander's supply lines. But Alexander had no significant navy of his own. His solution was brilliant. He would capture every port city on the Mediterranean coast, and without harbors, the Persian fleet would be useless. It was conquering the sea by conquering the land. Most cities surrendered quickly, but one did not. The island city of Tyre, built on a rocky outcrop half a mile from the coast, was one of the greatest fortresses in the ancient world. The Tyrians believed their walls were impregnable, protected by the sea itself. They sent ambassadors to Alexander saying he could worship at their temple on the mainland, but he could not enter their island city. Alexander responded that he would enter Tyre to sacrifice at the temple of Heracles, who he claimed as his ancestor. It was not a request. The siege of Tyre lasted 7 months, from January to August of 332 BCE, and it became one of the most remarkable engineering feats of ancient warfare. Since Tyre was an island, Alexander decided to build a causeway, a bridge of earth and stone, stretching from the mainland to the city walls. His soldiers and engineers worked day and night, filling the shallow waters with rocks, timber, and rubble. The Tyrians attacked the construction crews repeatedly, sending fire ships to burn the wooden siege towers, diving beneath the water to remove stones, raining arrows and projectiles on the workers. But Alexander was relentless. He brought in siege engines from across his conquered territories. He assembled a fleet by requisitioning ships from the Phoenician cities he had already captured. His engineers built siege towers taller than the walls of Tyre, mounting catapults and battering rams on his causeway. Month after month, the work continued. Finally, in August, the Macedonians breached the walls. Alexander's soldiers poured into the city. The Tyrians, who had resisted for so long, faced terrible retribution. 8,000 were killed in the assault, 30,000 were sold into slavery, and 2,000 captured defenders were crucified along the beach. It was a harsh lesson. Those who resisted Alexander paid dearly, but those who surrendered were treated with mercy. With Tyre fallen, the rest of the coast submitted quickly. Only Gaza, another fortified city, attempted resistance, and it too fell after a 2-month siege. By the end of 332 BCE, Alexander controlled the entire eastern Mediterranean coast. The Persian fleet had become irrelevant, its home ports all in enemy hands. And now Alexander stood at the border of Egypt, the ancient land of pyramids and pharaohs, a kingdom that had chafed under Persian rule for 2 centuries. The Egyptians welcomed Alexander as a liberator. The Persian satrap surrendered without a fight, and Alexander entered Memphis, the ancient capital, in triumph. He made sacrifices to the Egyptian gods, including the sacred Apis bull, showing respect for Egyptian religion in stark contrast to the Persians, who had sometimes treated Egyptian beliefs with contempt. The Egyptian priests recognized something useful in this young conqueror. He could be presented as a legitimate pharaoh, not a foreign invader. And so Alexander was crowned as Pharaoh of Egypt, given the traditional titles and the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. While in Egypt, Alexander founded one of his most famous cities. On the Mediterranean coast, near a small fishing village, he laid out the plans for Alexandria. He walked the perimeter himself, marking it with barley meal since chalk was not available, and birds came and ate the grain, which seers interpreted as a sign that the city would feed many nations. Alexandria would indeed become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a center of learning and trade that would outlast Alexander's empire by centuries. It was the first of more than 20 cities he would name after himself, but it was the one that would achieve the greatest glory. From the coast, Alexander made a journey that would transform his image forever. He traveled west across the Libyan desert to the Oracle of Ammonius at Siwa, one of the most sacred sites in the ancient world. The journey was dangerous. His party nearly perished from thirst when they lost their way, saved only, according to legend, by sudden rain and by ravens who guided them to the oasis. At the temple, the high priest greeted Alexander and, according to some accounts, addressed him as son of Ammonius, the Egyptian equivalent of Zeus. What was said in the inner sanctum of the temple, Alexander never fully revealed. But when he emerged, something had changed. He began to believe, or at least to claim, that he was not merely descended from gods, but was himself the son of Zeus Ammonius, divine by birth and not just by lineage. His companions were troubled by this. Macedonian kings were meant to be first among equals, ruling with the consent of their noble companions. The idea of a divine king was foreign, even dangerous. But Alexander was becoming something new, something that blended Greek, Macedonian, Persian, and Egyptian concepts of kingship. He was transforming from a Macedonian general into something the world had not seen before, a universal monarch, a king of many peoples, chosen by the gods themselves. As the year 331 BCE began, Alexander prepared to leave Egypt and march east once more. Darius had been given time to gather another massive army in the heart of his empire. The final confrontation was coming, a battle that would decide whether Alexander's conquering dream would continue or end in the dust of Mesopotamia. The young king who had started as ruler of a small northern kingdom now controlled Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt. But the true heart of the Persian Empire still beat, and Darius still held the ancient throne. The greatest battle of Alexander's life awaited him. In the warmth of the Egyptian sun, Alexander looked east across the desert, toward the distant rivers of Babylon and the infinite plains of Persia. His army had marched thousands of miles. They had besieged mighty cities and crossed mountains and deserts. And still, the journey was far from over. The horizon called, as it always would, promising glory and danger in equal measure. Alexander led his army out of Egypt in the spring of 331 BCE, crossing back into Syria and then turning east toward the heartland of the Persian Empire. Darius had spent the months since his defeat at Issus gathering forces from every corner of his vast realm. From the mountains of the Hindu Kush came fierce tribesmen. From the steppes rode Scythian horsemen. From Bactria and Sogdiana, from India's borders, from every satrapy and kingdom that owed allegiance to the great king, warriors came. And Darius had learned from his previous defeats. This time, he would choose the battlefield, a wide-open plain where his numbers could be fully deployed and his cavalry could maneuver freely. The two armies met at Gaugamela, near the ancient city of Nineveh in northern Mesopotamia, on the first day of October in 331 BCE. The night before the battle, Darius positioned his forces and waited. His army was so vast that it stretched across the plain like a human sea. Ancient historians claimed he commanded over 1,000,000 men, though modern estimates suggest perhaps 200,000, still vastly outnumbering Alexander's force of 47,000. Darius had even prepared the battlefield itself, ordering the ground leveled and smoothed to give his scythed chariots, war machines with blades extending from their wheels, room to operate. Alexander's generals urged him to attack at night, to use darkness to offset the Persian advantage in numbers. But Alexander refused. "I will not steal victory," he said. He wanted to defeat Darius in open battle, in daylight, where there could be no question of his superiority. While the Persians stood in formation all night, fearing a surprise attack, Alexander's men slept. The young king rested so peacefully that his officers had to wake him at dawn, worried that his calm was somehow a troubling sign. When morning came and the armies faced each other across the plain, the sight must have been overwhelming. The Persian line extended far beyond the Macedonian flanks on both sides. Darius had positioned himself in the center, in a high chariot where he could be seen by all his troops, with his elite cavalry and the feared immortals surrounding him. His plan was straightforward. The scythed chariots would break up the Macedonian phalanx, his overwhelming numbers would envelope Alexander's smaller force from the sides, and the battle would be won. The battle began with the charge of the scythed chariots, rolling forward with deadly blades spinning. But Alexander's men had prepared for this. The Macedonian phalanx opened gaps in their lines, and the chariots rolled harmlessly through while light infantry pelted them with javelins and pulled the drivers from their seats. Those few chariots that did reach the infantry lines found the long sarissa pikes of the phalanx waiting, and the horses refused to charge into the wall of spear points. The great weapon Darius had counted on had failed. Then came the moment of chaos that Alexander had been waiting for. As the Persian cavalry on the left wing pressed against Alexander's right, trying to outflank him, a gap opened in the Persian center. It was a small opening, barely noticeable in the dust and chaos of battle, but Alexander saw it instantly. With a cry, he led his companion cavalry in a wedge formation directly into that gap, driving like a spear toward Darius himself. Once again, the young Macedonian king was charging straight at the great king of Persia, and once again, the gamble was terrifying in its audacity. The fighting was desperate and close. Persian guards threw themselves at Alexander, trying to stop the wedge, but the Macedonian cavalry were the finest in the world, and they had trained for years to follow their king into the heart of any enemy formation. Alexander drove forward, sword in hand, always toward the royal standard, toward Darius. And Darius, seeing Alexander coming for him a second time, seeing his guards falling, made the same fateful choice he had made at Issus. He turned his chariot and fled the battlefield. But this time, the battle was not yet over. On the other wing, the Persian cavalry had actually broken through and were riding into the Macedonian camp, attacking the baggage train. Some of Darius's cavalry even managed to free some of the Persian royal family that Alexander had captured. For a terrible moment, it seemed the battle could still go either way. But Alexander's second-in-command, Parmenion, though hard-pressed, held the line. And when news spread that Darius had fled, the heart went out of the Persian army. What had been a battle became a pursuit, and what had been a pursuit became a massacre. Alexander chased Darius for 75 miles, desperate to capture the fleeing king, but Darius had too great a head start. The great king escaped, fleeing northeast toward the mountains of Media. Behind him, he left more than just a defeated army. He left his empire. The Battle of Gaugamela was the death blow to Persian power. After over 2 centuries as the world's superpower, the Achaemenid Persian Empire was finished. Everything that followed would be merely the claiming of what had already been won. Alexander marched south from the battlefield to claim his prizes. First came Babylon, the ancient city of wonders, with its hanging gardens and massive walls, its ziggurats reaching toward the heavens. The citizens opened the gates and welcomed Alexander as their liberator. The priests of Marduk, Babylon's chief god, recognized him as the legitimate king of Babylon, and Alexander entered the city in triumph, riding through streets lined with flowers and burning incense. He ordered the restoration of temples that the Persians had neglected, and he made sacrifices to Babylonian gods according to local custom. Here was the pattern emerging. Alexander did not simply conquer, he absorbed, he adapted, he presented himself as the rightful ruler according to each culture's own traditions. From Babylon, Alexander marched to Susa, one of the Persian Empire's administrative capitals. The city surrendered without resistance, and in the royal treasury, Alexander found wealth that staggered the imagination. 50,000 talents of gold and silver, an amount so vast that it took thousands of mules and camels months to transport it all. To put this in perspective, it was more wealth than existed in all of Greece combined. Alexander distributed generous bonuses to his soldiers, rewarding them for their loyalty and their incredible march across half the known world. But the greatest prize still awaited. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, the city of palaces where the great kings had received tribute from subject nations for 200 years, stood in the mountains to the southeast. Alexander marched toward it through the Persian gates, a narrow mountain pass defended by the satrap Ariobarzanes with a small force. It was one of the most defensible positions imaginable, a narrow defile where numbers meant nothing. Ariobarzanes had blocked the pass with walls and stationed men on the heights above. Alexander's first assault failed, driven back by boulders and arrows raining down from above. It was one of the few times in his career that Alexander was forced to retreat from a defensive position. But he did not give up. Local guides showed him a narrow mountain track that wound around the pass, and Alexander led a picked force on a winter march through deep snow, traversing dangerous paths at night to come upon the Persian defenders from behind. It was a move that required endurance and courage from his men, and they gave it willingly. When dawn broke, Ariobarzanes found himself attacked from both front and rear. He fought bravely but was overwhelmed. The pass was taken, and the road to Persepolis lay open. In January of 330 BCE, Alexander entered Persepolis, and his soldiers were given permission to loot the city, with one exception: the royal palaces were to be preserved. For months, the Macedonians and Greeks carried away treasures accumulated over 2 centuries of imperial tribute. Then, in the spring, during a celebration, something happened that would become one of the most debated events of Alexander's life. The royal palace of Xerxes, the very symbol of Persian imperial might, was set on fire. Ancient sources offer different explanations. Some say Alexander ordered it deliberately, as revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens during the Persian Wars over a century before, a final symbolic act closing the cycle of Greek-Persian conflict. Others claim it happened during a drunken revel, sparked by a courtesan named Thais who urged the Greeks to burn what the Persians had destroyed in Greece. Perhaps it was a calculated decision disguised as drunken impulse, allowing Alexander to have his revenge while maintaining plausible deniability. Whatever the truth, the flames that consumed Xerxes' palace marked the end of an era. The Persian Empire, as an independent political entity, ceased to exist. All that remained was to hunt down Darius and claim the title of Great King officially. But Darius was still alive, still fleeing through the eastern provinces of his former empire, and still, technically, the legitimate king of kings. Alexander would have to pursue him to the edges of the world to finish what he had started. And in doing so, Alexander would discover that conquering an empire and ruling it were 2 very different things. As the smoke rose from the ruins of Persepolis, carrying with it the ashes of Persian glory, Alexander stood among the treasures of kings and looked eastward once more. Darius was out there somewhere, beyond the mountains, fleeing into the distant provinces. And beyond Darius lay lands even Alexander had only heard of in travelers' tales, realms at the very edge of the world. The conquest had only just begun. Alexander left the ruins of Persepolis behind and marched northeast, following the trail of the fleeing Darius. The pursuit would take him through the heart of ancient Persia, through the provinces of Media and Parthia, into lands that grew more remote and rugged with every passing mile. Darius had fled to Ecbatana, the summer capital of the Persian kings, nestled in the mountains. But when Alexander approached, Darius fled again, this time with only a small force of loyal followers, heading toward the eastern satrapies where he hoped to raise another army. The chase became desperate. Alexander pushed his army hard, covering vast distances at extraordinary speed. He divided his forces, taking only his fastest troops and leaving the main army to follow at a more sustainable pace. Day after day, they marched through the summer heat, following reports and rumors of Darius's whereabouts. The great king was always just ahead, always just out of reach. And then, in July of 330 BCE, in the region of Parthia, Alexander's scouts brought him news that changed everything. Darius was dead. But he had not died in battle, and he had not died by Alexander's hand. His own generals, led by Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, had turned on him. They had urged Darius to surrender himself to Alexander as a bargaining chip, but when Darius refused, they stabbed him and left him dying by the roadside. When Alexander arrived, racing ahead with a small cavalry unit, he found Darius's body abandoned, lying in a wagon. The man who had ruled the greatest empire on earth had died alone, murdered by his own people. Alexander, who had wanted to capture Darius alive, to claim his throne through proper succession, was denied that final confrontation. According to legend, he covered Darius's body with his own cloak and ordered a royal funeral, declaring that Darius deserved the honors due to a king. The death of Darius changed Alexander's mission fundamentally. He was no longer simply a Greek general conquering Persian territory in revenge for past invasions. He was now, by his own declaration, the legitimate successor to Darius, the new king of kings, the rightful ruler of the entire Persian Empire. And Bessus, who had murdered the previous king and declared himself the new great king using the royal name Artaxerxes V, was a rebel and a regicide who needed to be brought to justice. This transformation in Alexander's identity troubled many of his Macedonian companions. They had followed him to conquer Persia, not to become Persians. But Alexander was thinking on a grander scale. He began adopting elements of Persian court ceremony. He started wearing a combination of Macedonian and Persian dress, a purple and white striped tunic and Persian diadem, though he stopped short of wearing the full royal robes. He introduced the Persian practice of proskynesis, a ritual where subjects would bow or prostrate themselves before the king, a practice that was normal for Persian subjects but deeply offensive to Greeks and Macedonians, who saw it as something done only before gods. The tension came to a head during a banquet at the city of Maracanda, in Sogdiana, in the autumn of 328 BCE. Alexander and his companions were drinking heavily, as they often did after campaigns. The conversation turned to Alexander's achievements and, inevitably, to comparisons with his father Philip. One of the older companions, Clitus, who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River years before, had grown increasingly bitter about what he saw as Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his increasing claims to divinity. Fueled by wine, Clitus began to speak critically, praising Philip's achievements and suggesting that Alexander's victories were due to his father's army, not his own genius. The argument escalated. Alexander, also drunk, grew furious. Clitus shouted that he had saved Alexander's life at Granicus, holding up his scarred hand as proof. Alexander responded with fury, calling Clitus a coward. Friends tried to separate them, but the rage had gone too far. When Clitus continued his insults, Alexander seized a spear from one of his guards and, in a moment of blind fury, hurled it at Clitus. The spear struck him in the chest, killing him instantly. The hall fell silent. Alexander, seeing what he had done, seeing his old friend dead by his own hand, collapsed in anguish. For 3 days, Alexander locked himself in his quarters, refusing food and water, weeping and calling out Clytus's name. His friends feared he might take his own life. Eventually, they convinced him that what had happened was tragic but that the army needed him, that his mission needed him. Philosophers were brought in to assure him that kings are not bound by the same moral laws as ordinary men, that sometimes harsh acts are necessary. But the death of Clytus haunted Alexander for the rest of his life. It was a stark reminder that even a man who believed himself destined for greatness could be destroyed by his own passions. The pursuit of Bessus continued. Alexander led his army into Bactria and Sogdiana, the wild eastern frontier of the former Persian Empire, regions that correspond to modern Afghanistan and parts of Central Asia. These were harsh lands, mountains and deserts, inhabited by fierce tribes who had only nominally submitted to Persian rule and saw no reason to submit to Alexander. The campaign in these regions would last nearly 3 years, from 330 to 327 BCE, and it would be some of the hardest fighting of Alexander's career. The warfare here was different from the great set-piece battles against Darius. This was guerrilla warfare, ambushes in mountain passes, sieges of remote fortresses perched on seemingly inaccessible crags. The local population, led by a Sogdian nobleman named Spitamenes, waged a relentless insurgency. They would attack supply columns, raid settlements, and then vanish into the mountains. When Alexander pursued them, they would retreat, and when he withdrew, they would return. It was frustrating, exhausting work, and it cost the lives of many soldiers. Finally, in 329 BCE, Alexander's forces captured Bessus. The man who had murdered Darius and claimed the Persian throne was brought before Alexander in chains. The sentence was brutal and very Persian in its justice. Bessus was mutilated, having his nose and ears cut off according to Persian custom for traitors, and then sent to Ecbatana where he was executed. Alexander had avenged Darius and eliminated a rival claimant to the throne. But the insurgency in the eastern provinces continued. During one of these campaigns, Alexander besieged a mountain fortress known as the Sogdian Rock. The fortress sat atop a cliff face so steep that the defenders believed it was impregnable. When Alexander demanded their surrender, they laughed and told him he would need soldiers with wings to capture their stronghold. Alexander offered a reward to the first men who could climb the cliff face at night. 300 volunteers used iron tent pegs and ropes to scale the icy rock in darkness. 30 of them fell to their deaths, but the rest reached the summit by dawn. When the defenders awoke to find Macedonian soldiers above them, they believed Alexander truly did have winged soldiers, and they surrendered in terror. In the Sogdian rock fortress, among the captives, was a Bactrian noblewoman named Roxana. Ancient sources describe her as one of the most beautiful women in Asia. Whether it was love, political calculation, or both, Alexander decided to marry her. The wedding took place in 327 BCE, following both Macedonian and Persian customs. By marrying Roxana, Alexander was binding himself to the Eastern nobility, showing that he truly meant to unite Greek and Persian, European and Asian, into a single empire. It was a symbolic act, but also a personal one. Despite everything, his ambitions, his armies, his pursuit of glory, Alexander was still a young man, not yet 30 years old, and perhaps he truly had fallen in love. The marriage to Roxana troubled some of Alexander's Macedonian companions, who saw it as another sign that their king was drifting away from his roots. But it was popular among his Persian subjects and soldiers, and Alexander was thinking now in terms of empire, not just Macedon. He promoted Persian nobles to positions of authority, incorporated Persian soldiers into his army, and continued to present himself as the rightful heir to the Achaemenid throne. He was creating something new, a fusion of East and West, with himself at the center. But even as he married and consolidated his rule over the eastern provinces, Alexander's ambitions looked further still. Beyond Bactria and Sogdiana lay India, a land of legend, where Greek merchants told stories of wise philosophers, exotic animals, and wealthy kingdoms. Alexander had reached the eastern edge of what had been the Persian Empire. But why stop there? The edge of the world, according to Greek geographers, could not be much farther. Perhaps just beyond India lay the great ocean that encircled all lands, the boundary beyond which no mortal could go. Alexander decided he would see it for himself. In the mountains of Bactria, as winter snow covered the high passes, Alexander sat in his tent and studied maps drawn by merchants and travelers. His Macedonian veterans, who had followed him for nearly 10 years now, whispered among themselves. How much farther would they march? When would they turn homeward? But Alexander's gaze was fixed on the east, on the unknown lands beyond the horizon, and home seemed very far away indeed. In the spring of 327 BCE, Alexander led his army across the Hindu Kush mountains, following the same passes that had once carried the armies of the Persian kings into India. The crossing was arduous, through snow-choked passes at elevations where the air grew thin and men struggled for breath. But the army persevered, and when they descended the eastern slopes, they entered a world unlike anything the Greeks and Macedonians had ever seen. India in Alexander's time was not a unified country but a patchwork of kingdoms and republics, some wealthy and powerful, others small and independent. The region Alexander entered first was the Punjab, the land of 5 rivers, which formed the northwestern frontier of the Indian subcontinent. Here, Alexander employed the same strategy that had served him throughout his conquests. He would ally with some kingdoms to help him conquer others, exploiting local rivalries and presenting himself as a liberator to those who opposed the dominant powers. The first major kingdom Alexander encountered was ruled by King Amhi, whose capital was Taxila, a great center of learning and trade. Amhi, facing pressure from rival kingdoms, saw opportunity in Alexander's arrival. He traveled to meet Alexander with gifts, including elephants, which fascinated the Macedonians who had never seen such creatures up close. Amhi offered alliance and submission, and Alexander accepted, treating Amhi as an honored ally rather than a conquered subject. Taxila opened its gates, and Alexander was impressed by the city's wealth, its philosophers, and its famous university where sages from across India came to study. But not all Indian rulers were willing to submit. The most powerful king in the region was Porus, who ruled a kingdom east of the Hydaspes River, one of the 5 great rivers of the Punjab. Porus was a formidable figure, said to stand over 7 feet tall, a giant of a man who commanded a large army that included 200 war elephants. When Alexander sent messengers demanding his submission, Porus replied that he would meet Alexander at the border of his kingdom, but he would come in arms. It was a defiant answer from a proud king, and it meant war. The 2 armies met at the Hydaspes River in June of 326 BCE, during the monsoon season when the river was swollen with rain and rushing with dangerous currents. Porus positioned his army on the eastern bank, with his war elephants in the front line, creating a living wall that would terrify horses and men alike. Alexander faced a seemingly impossible problem: how to cross a flooded river in the face of an enemy army. Any attempt at a direct crossing would be suicidal, with his men swept away by the current or slaughtered as they struggled ashore. For days, Alexander engaged in psychological warfare. He moved his troops up and down the western bank, making it seem as if he was preparing to cross at different points, forcing Porus to march his army back and forth until they grew exhausted from the false alarms. At night, Alexander's soldiers would create noise and commotion, and Porus would rouse his men in response. After several nights of this, when Alexander's men made noise, Porus stopped responding, believing it was just another feint. That was the moment Alexander had been waiting for. On a dark, stormy night, while leaving fires burning at his main camp to make it seem he was still there, Alexander led a picked force of cavalry and infantry 17 miles upstream to a wooded island where the river could be crossed. With rain masking the sound of their movement, they crossed on rafts and boats. By dawn, Alexander had 5,000 cavalry and 6,000 infantry on the eastern bank. When Porus learned that Alexander had crossed, he was forced to divide his forces, sending his son with cavalry and chariots to stop the invaders before they could consolidate their position. The Battle of the Hydaspes that followed was one of Alexander's most brilliant tactical victories, and also one of the most difficult. Porus's son attacked but was defeated and killed. When news reached Porus, the great king himself mounted his elephant and led his main army against Alexander. The battle raged for hours in the mud and rain. The war elephants charged into the Macedonian lines, trampling soldiers, using their trunks to grab men and smash them to the ground, creating terror and chaos. Horses reared and bolted at the sight and smell of the strange beasts. But Alexander's veterans were the most experienced soldiers in the world, and they had fought in every imaginable condition. His cavalry commanders, Seleucus and Craterus, executed a brilliant maneuver, attacking the flanks of Porus's army and driving Indian cavalry back into their own elephants. The Macedonian infantry, armed with their long sarissa pikes, began targeting the elephants themselves, stabbing at their legs and eyes. The wounded elephants panicked, trumpeting in pain and rage, and began turning on their own troops, trampling Indian soldiers in their frenzy. Slowly, the Macedonian formation compressed the Indian army into a smaller and smaller space, until Porus's soldiers could barely move. King Porus fought with magnificent courage, mounted on his elephant, directing his troops even as the battle was clearly lost. He was wounded by multiple javelins but refused to surrender or flee. Finally, when his elephant too was wounded and could no longer stand, the great beast gently knelt down to let his master dismount. Only then did Porus allow himself to be captured. Alexander, who respected courage above almost all other qualities, rode out to meet his defeated enemy. According to legend, Alexander asked Porus how he wished to be treated, and Porus replied simply, "As a king." Alexander was so impressed by Porus's dignity and defeat that he not only returned his kingdom to him but added territories to it, making Porus his ally and satrap of the region. The victory at Hydaspes came at a cost. Many soldiers had been killed or wounded in the brutal fighting. And Alexander lost something precious. His beloved horse Bucephalus, who had carried him from Greece to India, died shortly after the battle, either from wounds received in the fighting or simply from old age and exhaustion. Bucephalus had been with Alexander since he was a boy, had carried him through every major battle, had been his constant companion for nearly 20 years. Alexander wept for his horse and founded a city in his honor on the banks of the Hydaspes, naming it Bucephala. On the opposite bank, he founded another city called Nicaea, meaning victory. After the victory over Porus, Alexander continued eastward, crossing more rivers, subduing more kingdoms. His men marched through the monsoon rains, through mud that sucked at their sandals and made every step an ordeal. They fought against tribes who used poisoned arrows, weapons that inflicted agonizing deaths. They besieged cities where defenders fought with the desperation of people protecting their homes. The army was exhausted. Many were sick with tropical diseases they had never encountered, and they were farther from home than any Greek or Macedonian had ever traveled. Alexander came to the Hyphasis River, the modern Bias, which flows down from the Himalayas. Beyond it lay more kingdoms, and beyond those, Alexander believed, lay the edge of the world, the great encircling ocean. He called his men together and gave them a speech, urging them forward. He told them they were so close to reaching the eastern boundary of the earth, that just a little farther and they would have conquered everything there was to conquer. They would be able to say they had marched from one end of the world to the other. But this time, for the first time in Alexander's career, his men refused. They had marched for 8 years. They had crossed deserts and mountains, fought in dozens of battles, endured heat and cold and endless hardship. They had followed Alexander to the edge of the known world, but they would go no farther. The soldiers, led by the older veterans, stood firm. They wanted to go home. They wanted to see their families, to enjoy the wealth they had accumulated, to rest after years of constant campaigning. No amount of rhetoric from Alexander could move them. For 3 days, Alexander remained in his tent, refusing to see anyone, hoping his soldiers would change their minds, hoping they would relent as they always had before. But this time they did not. Finally, Alexander emerged and announced he would turn back. He made sacrifices to the gods, asking for omens about crossing the river, and conveniently the omens were unfavorable. It was a face-saving gesture, allowing Alexander to retreat without admitting defeat by his own men. But everyone knew the truth. At the Hyphasis River, the limits of Alexander's power had been reached. His will was indomitable, but his army was human, and humans have limits. Alexander ordered 12 enormous altars built on the banks of the Hyphasis, each 50 cubits high, monuments to the 12 Olympian gods and markers of the farthest point of his advance. Then he turned his army west, beginning the long journey home. But characteristically, Alexander would not simply retrace his steps. He had come to India by land, but he would return by a different route. He ordered ships built, a fleet of nearly 1,000 vessels, and decided he would travel down the river system of the Punjab, conquering and exploring as he went, until he reached the Indus River and eventually the sea. The journey down the rivers was almost as difficult as the battles had been. Alexander's army encountered fierce resistance from tribes along the riverbanks, particularly from the Mali, a warrior people who had resolved to fight to the death rather than submit. During the siege of Amali city in 325 BCE, Alexander performed one of the most reckless acts of his life. Frustrated by the slow progress of the siege, he scaled the city walls with only 3 companions, leaped down into the city before his troops could follow, and fought surrounded by enemies. An arrow pierced his breastplate and lodged in his lung, collapsing it. His guards fought desperately to protect their wounded king until Macedonian soldiers broke through the wall. Alexander barely survived, and for days his life hung in the balance. When news spread through the army that Alexander had been mortally wounded, panic set in. The soldiers believed that without Alexander, they would never make it home. When Alexander recovered enough to be moved, he insisted on being carried on a litter where his men could see him, waving his hand to show he was alive. The relief among the soldiers was overwhelming. They realized, perhaps for the first time, how completely their fate was tied to this one man. As Alexander's fleet sailed slowly down the Indus toward the sea, the wounded king lay in his cabin, recovering from the arrow that had nearly killed him. Around him, his veterans whispered prayers to the gods, grateful their king still lived. The Indian campaign had tested them all, had pushed them to the very limits of endurance. And still, the journey home stretched before them, across unknown deserts and hostile lands. The hardest part, they would discover, was yet to come. By the summer of 325 BCE, Alexander's fleet reached the mouth of the Indus River and the shores of the Indian Ocean. For Alexander, it was a momentous occasion. He sailed out into the open sea and made sacrifices to Poseidon, the god of the ocean, pouring libations into the waves and throwing golden cups into the water as offerings. He had reached what he believed was the great ocean that encircled the world, fulfilling part of his dream, even if he had not been able to march to its farthest shores. Now came the question of how to return home. Alexander's empire stretched from Greece to India, but the paths that connected it were long and uncertain. Alexander divided his forces for the return journey. The main fleet, under the command of his admiral Nearchus, would sail along the coast westward, exploring the shores of the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf, mapping coastlines that Greeks had never charted. The bulk of the army, under the veteran General Craterus, would march through the more hospitable northern route, back through the mountain passes into Persia. But Alexander himself chose the hardest path. Alexander decided to march his portion of the army, along with camp followers and families, through the Gadrosian Desert, the barren wasteland that stretched along the coast of what is now southern Pakistan and Iran. Ancient sources suggest that part of his motivation was to achieve something no other conqueror had managed. Even the legendary Assyrian queen Semiramis had failed to cross this desert. But there were also practical reasons. By marching along the coast, Alexander could support Nearchus's fleet, establishing supply depots and digging wells for the ships to use. What Alexander perhaps underestimated was just how brutal this desert would prove to be. The march through Gidroja lasted for 60 days and became the greatest disaster of Alexander's career. The army marched through landscapes where nothing grew, where the sun beat down with merciless intensity, and where water sources were few and far between. They traveled mostly at night to escape the worst of the heat, stumbling through sand and gravel and darkness. The guides lost their way repeatedly, as desert winds erased all tracks and landmarks. When they did find wells, the water was often brackish or insufficient for the thousands who needed it. Soldiers began to die from thirst and exhaustion. The camp followers, the women and children who had accompanied the army, suffered even more. When they found water, desperate men would drink until they made themselves sick or would fight over every drop. Flash floods from distant storms would sometimes sweep through dry riverbeds without warning, drowning soldiers who had bedded down in what seemed like safe locations. Pack animals collapsed and died, and their precious supplies had to be abandoned. The army's baggage train, carrying treasures from years of conquest, was gradually lightened as men chose survival over wealth. Ancient historians record that Alexander shared the hardships of his men. When water was scarce, he refused to drink if there was not enough for everyone. In one famous incident, soldiers found a small amount of water and brought it to Alexander in a helmet. The king took the helmet, looked at his thirsty soldiers watching him, and then poured the water onto the ground, declaring that if there was not enough for all, he would have none. Whether this story is true or embellished, it reflects how Alexander maintained the loyalty of his men even in the worst conditions, by suffering alongside them and by refusing to claim privileges they could not share. By the time the survivors emerged from the Gidrojan desert, perhaps 3/4 of those who had entered it were dead. Out of an estimated force of perhaps 25,000 soldiers and camp followers, only a fraction remained. It was a catastrophic loss, worse than any battle Alexander had fought. More men died in that desert march than had been killed in all his battles in India combined. It was a sobering reminder that nature could be a more terrible enemy than any army. But Alexander had survived, and so had enough of his core force to maintain control of his empire. In December of 325 BCE, he reached Carmania, a province of Persia, where he was reunited with Craterus and the main army that had taken the northern route. The reunion was bittersweet, as both groups learned of the terrible losses the other had suffered. Here too, Alexander received good news. Nearchus and the fleet had successfully navigated the coast and survived their own harrowing journey, mapping the Persian Gulf for the first time in Greek history. Alexander held a great celebration in Carmania, a festival of thanksgiving for their survival and their return to the civilized lands of the empire. But even as he celebrated, Alexander was receiving troubling reports about what had happened in his absence. He had been gone from the heart of his empire for nearly 7 years, campaigning in the remote east, and in that time, some of his governors and administrators had grown corrupt and ambitious, assuming perhaps that Alexander would never return. Several of his satraps had raised their own private armies, taxed their provinces excessively, and even murdered political rivals. Some had plundered the royal tombs at Persepolis and Pasargadae, stealing treasures and defiling the resting places of ancient Persian kings, including Cyrus the Great, whom Alexander revered. When Alexander investigated these reports, he acted with swift and terrible justice. Satraps who were found guilty of misconduct were arrested and executed. Alexander was sending a message: his absence did not mean his authority had diminished. The purge of corrupt officials was extensive. Some were undoubtedly guilty of serious crimes, but some historians believe Alexander also used this opportunity to remove officials who had opposed his policy of integrating Persians into the administration, replacing them with people more sympathetic to his vision of a unified empire. Whether justice or political calculation, the executions re-established Alexander's absolute control. In the spring of 324 BCE, Alexander arrived at Susa, one of the great capitals of his empire. Here he staged an extraordinary event that demonstrated his vision for the future, the Susa weddings. Alexander had been planning this for some time, a mass wedding ceremony that would bind Macedonian and Persian nobility together through marriage. Alexander himself married two Persian princesses, Statira, the daughter of Darius III, and Persidas, the daughter of the previous Persian king Artaxerxes III. This was in addition to his existing wife, Roxana, from Bactria. At the same ceremony, Alexander arranged for 92 of his senior officers and companions to marry Persian and Median noblewomen. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend and probably his lover, married Drapetis, Statira's sister, making him Alexander's brother-in-law. The weddings were conducted according to Persian custom, a symbolic gesture showing that Alexander honored Persian traditions. Alexander provided dowries for the brides and lavish gifts for the grooms. He also offered to pay off the debts of any soldiers who had married Asian women during the campaigns, and over 10,000 soldiers took him up on the offer. The Susa weddings were Alexander's most ambitious attempt at creating a true fusion of Greek and Persian cultures. He wanted an empire where Greek and Persian nobles were family, where the children of these marriages would be both Greek and Asian, creating a new ruling class that transcended the old divisions. It was a radical vision, centuries ahead of its time. But many of his Macedonian companions were deeply unhappy with it. They had not marched all these years to become Persians. Many would divorce their Persian wives after Alexander's death, showing that the cultural integration Alexander dreamed of was being imposed from above rather than embraced from below. Alexander also announced another controversial policy at Susa. He had been training 30,000 young Persian men in Macedonian military tactics and equipment, teaching them to fight in the phalanx formation. These young men, whom Alexander called the epigoni, meaning successors or inheritors, were now presented to the army. Alexander declared they would be incorporated into the Macedonian units, fighting alongside the veterans. To the Macedonian soldiers, this felt like a betrayal. They had won this empire with their blood, and now Alexander was replacing them with Persians. The discontent came to a head at the city of Opis on the Tigris River in the summer of 324 BCE. Alexander announced that older soldiers who were no longer fit for campaigning would be sent home to Macedonia with generous bonuses and pensions. But instead of gratitude, the announcement triggered a mutiny. The soldiers heard this as confirmation of their fears. Alexander was dismissing them so he could replace them with his Persian troops. The veterans began shouting that Alexander should send all of them home, and let him continue his campaigns with his father Ammonius, a bitter reference to Alexander's claims of divine parentage. Alexander's response was swift and furious. He leaped down from the platform where he had been speaking and personally pointed out the ringleaders of the protest, ordering his guards to arrest 13 of them. They were immediately executed. Then Alexander delivered one of the most powerful speeches of his life. He reminded his soldiers of everything they had achieved together, of every battle they had won, of the wealth and glory they had gained. He reminded them of what Macedonia had been before his father Philip had transformed it, and what it had become under his leadership. And then he played his final card. He told them he didn't need them. He would make the Persians the core of his new army. He dismissed the assembly and locked himself in his quarters. For 3 days, Alexander refused to see his Macedonian troops. The soldiers, realizing they had pushed too far, began to panic. Without Alexander's favor, they were nothing. Finally, the veterans came to his quarters and pleaded to be allowed back into his presence. They stood outside weeping, begging forgiveness. Alexander emerged, and when he saw his old soldiers in tears, he too began to weep. The soldiers cried out that he had made Persians his kinsmen but had called none of them his relatives. Alexander replied that he called all of them his kinsmen, and embraced them. The reconciliation was sealed with a great banquet, where 9,000 people sat together, Macedonians and Persians side by side, drinking from the same mixing bowl, sharing food, celebrating their unity. Alexander prayed for harmony and partnership between Macedonians and Persians, for a shared rule of his empire. It was a moving gesture, but it could not completely erase the underlying tensions. The older veterans did indeed go home, 10,000 of them, led by Craterus. They left with their bonuses and their honors, but they also left with the knowledge that Alexander's vision had grown beyond them. As autumn approached and the soldiers who had chosen to return home marched west toward Macedonia, those who remained behind looked at their young king with mixed emotions. He had led them to the edge of the world and back. He had made them rich beyond their dreams. But he had also changed, become something more and less than the young prince who had left Macedon 12 years before. And there were still campaigns ahead, still plans forming in Alexander's restless mind. For a man who believed himself destined to rule the world, there was always another horizon. In the autumn of 324 BCE, Alexander traveled to Ecbatana, the ancient summer capital of the Persian kings, nestled in the mountains where the air was cool and clear. He went there to rest, to make plans, and to spend time with his closest companion. Hephaestion had been with Alexander since childhood. They had studied together under Aristotle, fought side by side in every major battle, and shared a bond that went deeper than friendship. Ancient sources are discreet about the exact nature of their relationship, but it seems clear that Hephaestion was the person Alexander loved most in the world. At Ecbatana, games and festivals were held, entertainment after years of hard campaigning. But in the midst of the celebrations, Hephaestion fell ill with a fever. The illness came on suddenly, and at first it did not seem serious. Alexander's physicians attended him, and Hephaestion seemed to be recovering. Alexander, reassured, left to attend athletic competitions. But while Alexander was away, Hephaestion defied his doctor's orders, ate a hearty meal, and drank wine. His condition suddenly worsened, and by the time Alexander was summoned back, it was too late. Hephaestion died in Alexander's arms. Alexander's grief was beyond measure. He was inconsolable, lying beside Hephaestion's body for an entire day, refusing food or water, refusing to be moved. When he finally rose, he ordered the doctor who had been treating Hephaestion to be crucified, perhaps unfairly blaming him for the death, perhaps simply needing someone to punish for his unbearable loss. He had the manes cut from all the horses and mules in the camp, as was Macedonian custom when mourning. He ordered that the sacred flame in nearby temples be extinguished, an honor usually reserved for the death of the great king himself. Alexander sent messengers to the oracle of Ammonius in Egypt, asking whether Hephaestion should be honored as a god or merely as a hero. While waiting for the response, Alexander threw himself into military action, as if trying to outrun his grief. He launched a brutal campaign against the Cassians, a mountain tribe in the Zagros Mountains, killing every adult male in what ancient sources called a sacrifice to Hephaestion's shade. It was a dark turn, this transformation of grief into violence, and it showed how much Hephaestion's death had shaken Alexander's emotional balance. When the oracle's reply came back, it stated that Hephaestion could be honored as a divine hero, which was the highest honor short of actual divinity. Alexander ordered the construction of an enormous funeral pyre in Babylon, which would cost 10,000 talents, a staggering sum. The pyre was to be adorned with elaborate decorations, sculptures, and precious materials, a monument worthy of the man Alexander had loved most. But Alexander would never see it completed. After the campaign against the Kassians, Alexander moved to Babylon in the spring of 323 BCE. The ancient city would serve as his administrative capital as he planned his next campaigns. And Alexander's ambitions had not diminished with age or grief. Now 32 years old, he was planning expeditions that would make his Indian campaign seem modest by comparison. He wanted to conquer Arabia, to circumnavigate Africa, to explore the western Mediterranean and perhaps conquer Carthage and Rome. He dreamed of unifying the entire known world under his rule. Embassies came to Babylon from across the world. From Libya, from Ethiopia, from the Italian peninsula, from the distant shores of the Black Sea, representatives came to honor Alexander or to seek his favor. Some ancient sources claim that even envoys from Gaul and from Iberia arrived, though this may be exaggeration. What is certain is that Alexander's fame had spread to the farthest reaches of the known world, and kingdoms everywhere recognized that a new order had emerged, centered on this Macedonian king who called himself the son of Zeus. But there were troubling omens. Babylonian priests warned Alexander not to enter the city from the east, citing prophecies and astronomical observations that suggested danger. Alexander initially heeded the warning and approached from another direction, but the detour proved difficult, and eventually he entered through the eastern gate anyway, dismissing the priest's concerns. Other strange signs were reported. A tame lion was killed by a wild ass in the palace grounds. A man wearing Alexander's royal diadema was found sitting on the throne, and when questioned, he claimed divine voices had told him to do it. The man was executed, but the incident was seen as a dark omen. In early June of 323 BCE, Alexander attended a long banquet hosted by his friend Medius of Larissa. The drinking went on through the night, as was common at Macedonian celebrations. The next day, Alexander felt unwell but attended another banquet anyway. That evening, he developed a fever. At first, it did not seem alarming. Fevers were common in the marshlands around Babylon during summer. But this fever did not break. Day by day, Alexander's condition worsened. The fever climbed higher. He could not eat and could barely drink. His physicians tried every remedy they knew, but nothing helped. For 12 days, Alexander lay in his bed in the palace at Babylon, his life slowly ebbing away. Ancient sources differ on the details of his illness. Some describe symptoms consistent with malaria or typhoid fever, both common in Mesopotamia. Others whispered of poison, suggesting that one of Alexander's generals or servants had finally acted on ambitions or grudges held for years. Modern historians debate the cause, but what matters is that Alexander, who had survived dozens of battles and terrible wounds, who had crossed deserts and mountains, was dying in bed from illness. As his condition deteriorated, his soldiers demanded to see him, fearing rumors that he was already dead, suspecting his generals might be hiding his death to consolidate their own power. Alexander, barely conscious, ordered that his bed be moved near the doorway, and his soldiers filed past one by one. He could not speak, but he raised his hands slightly to each man, acknowledging them, a final farewell to the army that had followed him across the world. Some of the hardened veterans wept openly as they passed their dying king. His commanders gathered around him, asking the crucial question, "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" The sources give different answers to what Alexander said, if he said anything at all. Some claim he whispered to the strongest, suggesting that whoever could seize and hold power should rule. Others say he answered to the best, or that he said to Craterus, naming his veteran general who was even then marching back to Macedonia. Some sources claim he was too weak to speak and merely handed his signet ring to Perdiccas, his senior cavalry commander. The truth has been lost to history, obscured by the competing claims of those who sought to justify their own actions after his death. What is certain is that Alexander did not clearly designate a successor, and this failure, whether due to his sudden illness or to some deeper reluctance to name anyone as equal, would have catastrophic consequences. His empire, won through brilliance and blood over 13 years of campaigning, would tear itself apart in the wars of the Diadochi, the successors, within months of his death. On June 10 or 11, 323 BCE, in the evening, in the palace at Babylon, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old. In his short life, he had conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to India, from Egypt to Central Asia. He had founded cities, some of which would endure for millennia. He had spread Greek culture and language across the known world, creating what historians would call the Hellenistic Age. He had been proclaimed a god by some and had believed it himself. And now he was gone, leaving behind a world transformed in an empire without an heir. The news of Alexander's death spread slowly at first, then raced across his empire and beyond. In Greece, some celebrated, hoping to throw off Macedonian rule. In Persia, some mourned the king who had treated Persian nobles with respect. In Macedonia, his mother Olympias heard that her son, whom she had raised to believe he was destined for greatness, had died far from home. His wife Roxana was pregnant with Alexander's child, who would be born a few months later and named Alexander IV, but the infant would never truly rule, merely serve as a pawn in the power struggles of his father's generals. Alexander's body was preserved in honey and gold, and plans were made to transport it back to Macedonia for burial alongside his ancestors. But as the funeral cortege began its journey, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals who had claimed Egypt as his territory, intercepted it and brought Alexander's body to Memphis, and later to Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded. There, in the city that bore his name, Alexander was entombed in a magnificent mausoleum where he would rest for centuries, visited by Julius Caesar, Augustus, and countless others who sought to draw inspiration or legitimacy from the conqueror's legacy. The empire Alexander had built did not survive intact. His generals, the Diadochi, fought brutal wars for decades, eventually dividing the empire into several kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Persia and the East, Antigonid Macedonia, and smaller kingdoms carved from the whole. But though the political unity was lost, Alexander's cultural legacy endured. Greek became the common language of the educated classes from the Mediterranean to India. Greek art, philosophy, and science spread throughout these lands, mingling with local traditions to create new forms of expression. Cities Alexander had founded became centers of learning and trade. In the years after Alexander's death, his veterans would gather and tell stories of the young king who had led them to the edge of the world. They spoke of his courage, his brilliance, his vision of a unified humanity. They spoke too of his flaws, his growing arrogance, his terrible rages, his impossible demands. But mostly they remembered the glory, the sense that they had been part of something unprecedented, that they had witnessed and helped create something the world had never seen before and might never see again. Alexander was gone, but the legend of Alexander the Great was just beginning. In the immediate aftermath of Alexander's death, the great palace at Babylon became a place of confusion and intrigue. His generals and companions, men who had followed him for years and commanded armies that had conquered the world, now faced an impossible question: how do you divide the indivisible? How do you replace a man who had been proclaimed a living god, who had personally led every major campaign, whose charisma and vision had held together an empire of such vast diversity? Alexander's wife Roxana was pregnant, carrying what would be Alexander's only legitimate child. But the baby was not yet born, and the empire needed leadership immediately. Alexander also had a half-brother, Philip III Aristeus, the son of Philip II by another wife. But Aristeus was mentally disabled, unfit to rule in any meaningful sense. The question of succession had no good answer, and in the absence of a clear heir, power naturally flowed to those who commanded the loyalty of the armies. The generals held a council, and after heated debate, they reached a compromise. They would wait for Roxana's child to be born, and if it was a boy, he would be king alongside Philip Aristeus, with the generals serving as regents. When Roxana did give birth to a son, Alexander IV, the child was proclaimed king, but he was a king in name only, a symbol used by the generals to legitimize their own authority. The real power lay with the commanders of the various armies, and they all had their own ambitions. Perdiccas, who held Alexander's signet ring, claimed to be the supreme regent. Ptolemy seized Egypt and began building his own dynasty there. Antigonus took control of much of Asia Minor. Seleucus claimed Babylon and the eastern territories. Cassander fought for control of Macedonia itself. These men had been brothers in arms, had fought together, celebrated together, nearly died together. But Alexander's death released them from the unity his presence had enforced, and they turned on each other with the same ferocity they had once directed at their enemies. The wars of the Diadochi, the wars of the successors, would last for more than 40 years. It was a brutal period of shifting alliances, betrayals, and battles fought across 3 continents. Families were destroyed, cities were besieged, and thousands died as these generals carved out their own kingdoms from Alexander's empire. Roxana and the young Alexander IV became pawns in these power struggles, moved from place to place, guarded and imprisoned in equal measure. In 310 BCE, Cassander, who had taken control of Macedonia, ordered both Roxana and the 14-year-old Alexander IV murdered, ending Alexander the Great's bloodline forever. Olympias, Alexander's mother, tried to secure her grandson's inheritance, but she too was drawn into the wars. She was captured by Cassander and executed in 316 BCE, stoned to death by the relatives of men she herself had ordered killed. The family that had risen to such heights, that had conquered the known world, was extinguished in blood and violence within a generation. Yet even as Alexander's family in his united empire died, his legend grew. The stories told about him became more elaborate with each retelling. He was said to have descended into the ocean in a glass diving bell to explore the underwater world. He supposedly flew into the sky carried by giant birds, trying to reach the heavens. Tales spread of his encounters with Amazonian queens, with mysterious races of people at the edges of the world, with fantastic beasts and magical places. These stories, compiled in what became known as the Alexander Romance, spread throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa, translated into dozens of languages, each culture adding its own elements to the legend. In the kingdoms that emerged from his empire, Alexander was remembered differently by different peoples. In Egypt, he was honored as a legitimate pharaoh who had respected their gods and their traditions. The Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt for 3 centuries traced its legitimacy back to Alexander through Ptolemy, his general and friend. The Great Library of Alexandria, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, the city's emergence as the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world, all of this was built on foundations Alexander had laid. In Persia and the lands to the east, the memory was more complex. The Seleucid Empire that controlled these regions for generations drew its authority from Alexander's conquest, yet they also had to govern populations that remembered the burning of Persepolis, the conquest of their homeland. Over time, Persian and other Eastern sources would develop a more ambiguous view of Alexander, seeing him as both a brilliant conqueror and a destroyer of ancient traditions. In Persian literature, he became Iskander, a figure of legend who could be portrayed as hero, villain, or something in between, depending on the story being told. In India, where Alexander had fought King Porus and reached the limits of his advance, he left a lasting impression on the local kingdoms. The Indo-Greek kingdoms that emerged in the centuries after his death, particularly in Bactria and the northwestern regions, preserved Greek culture and artistic styles while blending them with Buddhist and Hindu traditions. The famous Gandhara art style, which depicts Buddha with Greek-influenced features and clothing, is a direct result of the cultural exchange Alexander's campaigns initiated. In Indian sources, Alexander appears as a foreign king who was ultimately turned back, a reminder that even the greatest conqueror had limits. Greek and Macedonian sources naturally remembered Alexander as the greatest hero of their age. Historians who had accompanied his campaigns wrote detailed accounts, though most of these original histories have been lost and survive only through later writers who drew upon them. Arian, writing in the 2nd century CE, more than 400 years after Alexander's death, compiled what is considered the most reliable ancient account of Alexander's campaigns, drawing on sources written by men who had been there. Plutarch wrote a biography that explored not just Alexander's deeds but his character, portraying him as a complex figure of great virtues and equally great flaws. The Romans, who built their own vast empire centuries after Alexander, saw him as both an inspiration and a challenge. Julius Caesar famously wept when reading about Alexander's achievements, lamenting that at age 32, Alexander had conquered the world while Caesar himself had accomplished so little. Roman generals consciously imitated Alexander's tactics and his style of leadership. The young Pompey styled himself Pompey the Great in deliberate imitation. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, visited Alexander's tomb in Alexandria and paid his respects to the conqueror whose empire had paved the way for Rome's own dominance. In the medieval period, Alexander's story took on new dimensions. Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions all incorporated him into their narratives. In Islamic tradition, he became Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, mentioned in the Quran as a righteous king who built a wall to protect civilization from the destructive forces of Gog and Magog. Medieval European literature portrayed him as a model of chivalry and martial prowess, a Christian knight avant la lettre, despite the fact that he had lived centuries before Christ. The cities Alexander founded became his most enduring legacy. While many disappeared over time, others flourished and still exist today. Alexandria in Egypt, the most famous, would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient and medieval world, home to the legendary library, to scholars like Euclid and Eratosthenes, a cosmopolitan center where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and other cultures mixed and created new forms of knowledge and art. Herat, Kandahar, and other cities in Afghanistan trace their origins to Alexander's foundations, though their modern names have evolved from the Greek originals. But perhaps Alexander's greatest legacy was not military or political but cultural. By conquering the Persian Empire and marching to India, by founding cities and encouraging his soldiers to marry local women, by adopting elements of Persian and Eastern culture himself, Alexander created what historians call the Hellenistic world. Greek language, art, philosophy, and science spread throughout the territories he had conquered and beyond. For centuries after his death, educated people from Spain to India could communicate in Greek. The New Testament would be written in Greek because it was the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean. Buddhist texts would be translated into Greek. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge would flow between cultures using Greek as the medium. This cultural fusion was not without costs. Traditional cultures were disrupted or displaced. Local languages and customs were sometimes overwhelmed by Greek influence. The spread of Hellenistic culture was not a peaceful exchange but the result of conquest. Yet it created a more connected world, where ideas could travel farther and faster than ever before, where a scholar in Alexandria could read texts from India, where artistic styles from Greece could influence Buddhist sculpture, where the boundaries between East and West became more permeable. Alexander's military tactics influenced warfare for centuries. His use of combined arms, cavalry, infantry, archers, and siege equipment working in coordination, became the model for later commanders. The Macedonian phalanx, with its long sarissa pikes, was studied and imitated. His strategy of rapid movement, of attacking the enemy's center of gravity, of leading from the front to inspire his troops, became lessons taught to military leaders throughout history. Napoleon studied Alexander's campaigns. So did every military academy in the modern world. But beyond tactics and strategy, Alexander represented something more intangible, the idea that the impossible could be achieved, that the world could be changed by individual will and courage. He showed that geographical and cultural boundaries that seemed permanent could be crossed, that empires that appeared invincible could fall, that a single lifetime could reshape human history. Whether that lesson inspired greatness or justified tyranny would depend on who learned it and how they applied it. More than 2,000 years after Alexander's death, his name is still known to schoolchildren across the world. Statues of him stand in cities from Macedonia to Afghanistan. Books and films still tell his story, each generation finding something different in his life to admire or condemn, to learn from or to argue against. The young king from Macedon who believed himself destined for greatness has become, through the alchemy of time and legend, a permanent part of human consciousness, a symbol of ambition, conquest, courage, and the price of glory. As we come to the end of this journey through Alexander's life, it seems fitting to pause and reflect on what his story means, not just as history, but as a meditation on human nature, on ambition, on the costs of greatness, and on the question of what we leave behind when we are gone. Alexander lived only 32 years, yet he compressed into that brief span achievements that would have been remarkable across multiple lifetimes. From the moment he tamed Bucephalus as a 12-year-old boy to the day he died in Babylon, his life was a constant forward motion, an endless reaching toward the horizon. He never stopped, never rested, never seemed satisfied with what he had already accomplished. There was always another city to conquer, another river to cross, another empire to subjugate. This relentless drive was both his greatest strength and perhaps his deepest flaw. What drove him? Was it the ambition his mother Olympias had instilled in him from childhood, telling him he was descended from gods and heroes? Was it the need to surpass his father Philip, to prove himself greater than the man who had given him his army and his opportunity? Was it the influence of Homer's Iliad, which he had carried with him throughout his campaigns, the desire to be another Achilles, to achieve glory that would echo through the ages? Or was it something more primal, an insatiable hunger that no conquest could ever truly satisfy? Ancient sources tell us that when Alexander heard that there might be infinite worlds beyond our own, he wept, lamenting that he had not yet conquered even one. Whether this story is true or apocryphal, it captures something essential about his character. For Alexander, there were no limits he acknowledged, no boundaries he accepted as final. The phrase impossible seemed not to exist in his vocabulary. When faced with a fortress on an unconquerable cliff, he found men willing to climb it. When faced with an ocean, he built a fleet. When told he could not defeat the Persian Empire with his relatively small army, he did it anyway. But this refusal to accept limits came with costs. The soldiers who loved him and followed him also died for him, thousands upon thousands over 13 years of campaigning. The cities that resisted him were destroyed, their populations killed or enslaved. His own friends and companions sometimes fell victim to his rages or his suspicions. Clitus, who had saved his life, died by his hand in a drunken argument. Parmenion, his father's trusted general, was executed on Alexander's orders after his son Philotas was convicted of conspiracy. Callisthenes, who had chronicled Alexander's deeds, was arrested and died in custody for refusing to perform proskynesis before the king. Alexander's treatment of conquered peoples was complex and contradictory. He could show remarkable mercy and cultural sensitivity, as he did with Darius's family, with King Porus, and with the Persian nobles he incorporated into his administration. He genuinely seemed to believe in his vision of a unified empire where Greek and Persian could be equals, where cultural boundaries could dissolve. Yet he could also be brutally ruthless, as the destruction of Thebes demonstrated, or the massacre at Tyre, or the campaign against the Cassians that he conducted as a sacrifice to Hephaestion's memory. Perhaps what made Alexander so effective as a conqueror was precisely this combination of vision and ruthlessness, of cultural sophistication and martial brutality, of personal courage and strategic calculation. He was not a simple character, not a straightforward hero or villain, but a figure of profound contradictions. He studied philosophy with Aristotle yet burned Persepolis. He claimed to bring freedom to Greek cities yet established autocratic control. He married Persian princesses to show cultural unity yet his Macedonian soldiers saw it as betrayal. The question of how we should judge Alexander has occupied historians and philosophers for millennia. Some see him as one of history's greatest military geniuses, a visionary who tried to unite East and West, a spreader of Greek civilization and culture. Others see him as a megalomaniacal conqueror whose campaigns brought death and destruction, whose vision was merely propaganda to justify endless warfare, whose legacy was not unity but the fragmentation of his empire and decades of civil war. Perhaps both views are true. Perhaps Alexander was both the brilliant leader who showed that barriers between cultures could be broken and the violent conqueror who left rivers of blood in his wake. Perhaps he was both the young man who wept for Hephaestion and the king who casually ordered executions when politically convenient. Perhaps he contained multitudes, as all complex human beings do, magnified to world historical scale. What seems certain is that Alexander believed absolutely in his own destiny. From childhood, he was told he was special, marked for greatness, descended from gods. And remarkably, the world seemed to confirm this belief again and again. Every seemingly impossible obstacle he overcame, every victory he won against overwhelming odds, every time he survived wounds that should have been fatal, all of this reinforced his conviction that he was chosen, that the gods favored him, that his success was not merely the result of skill and luck but of divine will. This belief gave him the confidence to attempt things other men would never dare, but it also led him toward increasing claims of divinity that alienated many of his companions. The boy who had been told he was descended from Heracles and Achilles became the man who claimed to be the son of Zeus Ammonius, who expected to be worshipped as a god. Whether he truly believed this in his heart or whether it was political theater designed to legitimize his rule over diverse peoples with different concepts of kingship, we cannot know. Perhaps Alexander himself did not fully know where the political calculation ended and the genuine belief began. In the end, Alexander's life poses questions rather than answering them. What is the value of conquest? What does it mean to be great? Is it worth sacrificing everything, home, peace, personal relationships, perhaps even one's humanity, for the sake of eternal fame? Alexander achieved the glory he sought. His name has indeed echoed through the millennia. But at what cost? He died young, far from home, surrounded by generals already planning to divide his empire. He never saw Macedonia again after he left at age 22. He lost his closest friend. He had no heir who survived to carry on his legacy. And yet, there is something undeniably compelling about his story. The sheer audacity of what he attempted, the courage he displayed leading charges personally, the vision of a unified world that transcended narrow nationalism, these things speak to something deep in human nature, our desire to transcend limits, to achieve something that will outlast our brief lives, to matter in the grand scheme of history. Perhaps the real lesson of Alexander's life is not whether we should emulate him, but rather what his story reveals about the human condition. We all face choices between ambition and contentment, between pushing forward and knowing when to stop, between changing the world and accepting it as it is. Most of us will never face these questions on Alexander's scale, but we face them nonetheless in our own lives. As you drift towards sleep, consider the young man who left his homeland with an army and a dream, who crossed mountains and deserts and rivers, who faced death countless times and kept moving forward, who tried to unite the world and succeeded only in conquering it, who believed himself destined for immortality and achieved it, though not in the way he might have imagined. Consider what drives us all to reach beyond our grasp, to dream of impossible things, to leave something behind that says we were here, we mattered, we made a difference. Alexander the Great died more than 2,000 years ago, but his story lives on, told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, because it speaks to fundamental questions about ambition, glory, mortality, and meaning. And perhaps that is the greatest conquest of all, not of territory or kingdoms, but of time itself, to live in such a way that your story continues to matter long after you are gone. Rest now, and dream perhaps of ancient roads stretching toward distant horizons, of armies marching beneath unfamiliar stars, of cities rising where deserts once stood, of a young king who believed the world was not large enough to contain his ambitions, and who, for a brief moment in history, almost proved himself right. Sleep peacefully, knowing that all journeys end, all empires fall, and yet the stories we tell about them continue, whispers carried forward through time, from one generation to the next, forever.